The notification light on Julia's phone pulsed against the marble countertop, a soft, rhythmic blue that sliced through the dim ambiance of their Seattle penthouse. Andrew, calculating the monthly mortgage payments at the other end of the table, noticed she didn't just check the message. She protected it, tilting the screen away with a reflex born of guilt. It wasn't the silence of their marriage that was deafening. It was the noise of the life she was planning to leave him for. If the unraveling of a decade-long vow intrigues you, and you want to see what remains when the romantic illusions are stripped away by cold reality, stay with me. The bill for betrayal always comes due eventually. The rain in Seattle didn't wash things clean. It just made the gray deeper. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of their downtown condo, Andrew watched the city lights blur against the glass. It was 11:30 p.m. The only light in the living room came from the glow of his laptop screen and the digital embers of the gas fireplace. On the screen, a spreadsheet was open. Andrew was an architect. He understood load-bearing walls, stress points, and the precise moment a structure became unstable. Currently, he was looking at the financial equivalent of a hairline fracture in the foundation. "You're still up?" Julia's voice was soft, but it carried a jagged edge that hadn't been there a year ago. She stood in the hallway entrance, wearing the silk robe he had bought her for her 32nd birthday. She looked beautiful, but it was a distant museum exhibit kind of beauty. "Just reviewing the monthly outgoings," Andrew said, not looking away from the screen. "There's a recurring charge of $500 to a Venmo account I don't recognize, and the credit card bill is unusual." Julia walked into the room, tightening the sash of her robe. She didn't come to the sofa to sit beside him. She went to the kitchen island, putting granite and distance between them. "I needed some supplies for the gallery." "Supplies don't cost $3,000 at a boutique hotel in Portland, Julia." Andrew finally turned to face her. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. It was the voice of a man who had been holding up the ceiling for too long. Julia stiffened. She poured a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. The silence that stretched between them was heavy, filled with the things Andrew had suspected but refused to articulate. He watched her profile, the way she avoided his gaze, the way she was already defending herself against an accusation he hadn't fully made yet. "It's not what you think," she said, her back to him. "Then tell me what it is, because to me it looks like you're building a life somewhere else using the bricks from this one." Julia turned around, setting the glass down hard enough to risk a crack. The facade dropped. The timid guilt vanished, replaced by a sudden righteous indignation that stunned him. "I went to Portland with Julian," she said. The name hung in the air like smoke. Julian, the visionary painter she had been representing for 6 months. The man who wore scarves indoors and spoke in fragments. Andrew closed his laptop. The click sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You're sleeping with him." "I'm connecting with him, Andrew. Something I haven't done with you in years." She took a step forward, her eyes flashing with a cruel sort of clarity. "He sees me. He doesn't look at me and see a co-applicant on a mortgage or a schedule to be managed. He sees me. I see you, Julia. I see you every day. I work 12 hours a day so we can have this life. This life." She gestured around the immaculate apartment, dismissing the Italian leather, the view, the security. "This is your life, Andrew. It's cold. It's sterile. Julian offers me something real. He loves me for who I am, not for what I can contribute to a 401k. Andrew felt a cold numbness spread through his chest. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the arrogance of it. "You think this," he pointed to the room, "just happens? You think safety is accidental?" "I think safety is a prison," she declared, lifting her chin. "And I'm done being your inmate. I'm leaving, Andrew. I'm going to someone who truly loves me." Andrew looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger who had never paid an electricity bill in her life. "Okay," Andrew whispered. "Okay?" She blinked, expecting a fight, a plea, something to validate the drama of the moment. "Okay," he repeated, standing up. He felt strangely light, the burden of the spreadsheet gone. "If he loves you that much, I'm sure he'll take excellent care of you." The silence that followed Andrew's capitulation was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm that refuses to break. Julia stood frozen for a moment, her script derailed. She had prepared for shouting, for tears, perhaps even for Andrew to block the doorway. His quiet acceptance robbed her of the victimhood she had been nurturing for months. Recovering her resolve, she turned on her heel and marched toward the master bedroom. The click of her heels on the hardwood floor echoed with a sharp, militaristic rhythm. Andrew followed, not to stop her, but to witness the demolition. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching as she pulled 2 large suitcases from the back of the walk-in closet. They were Toomey hardshells, he noted absently. He had bought them for their anniversary trip to Napa last year, a trip she had spent mostly texting Julian under the table. Julia moved with a frantic energy, pulling hangers from the rails. Silk blouses, cashmere sweaters, and designer denim flew into the open cases. There was no logic to her packing, only a desperate need to consume as much space as possible. "You think you're so superior," Julia muttered, her voice muffled as she reached for a stack of folded sweaters on the top shelf. "Standing there, judging me. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own home." "I'm not judging you, Julia," Andrew said, his voice level. "I'm just watching you pack." He watched her grab the limited edition handbag he had tracked down in Paris. She didn't hesitate to stuff it next to her running shoes. It was a fascinating contradiction. She was fleeing the prison of his materialism, yet she was meticulously looting the cell before she left. She wanted the romance of the starving artist lifestyle, but she was bringing $600 moisturizer and Italian leather with her. "Julian is waiting for me," she said, pausing to look at him, her eyes shining with a feverish intensity. "He's picking me up downstairs, in his van." "The van," Andrew repeated. He knew the vehicle. It was a rusted Ford Econoline that Julian called the Vessel. It usually smelled of turpentine and damp upholstery. "It's not much, but it's real," she shot back, interpreting his tone correctly. "We're going to his studio. We're going to make art. We're going to live authentically." She zipped the first suitcase with a struggle, the heavy zipper protesting against the volume of clothes. Andrew stepped forward, not to touch her, but to pick up a small framed photograph she had knocked over in her haste. It was from their wedding day. "Does authentic living require the platinum Amex?" he asked, placing the photo face down on the dresser. Julia froze. She looked at the wallet on the nightstand, then back at him. A flash of hesitation crossed her face, the first crack in her armor, but she smothered it quickly. She snatched the wallet. "I'm only taking what I need until I get settled. I'm not unreasonable, Andrew. I just need a bridge." "A bridge," he echoed. She hauled the suitcases off the bed, the wheels thudding against the carpet. "You'll hear from my lawyer, but don't try to drag this out. I don't want your money. I just want out. She brushed past him. The scent of her perfume, Santal 33, another relic of their budget, washing over him one last time. She didn't look back. She didn't say goodbye to the apartment, or the view, or the 10 years of history contained within these walls. She just dragged the heavy cases down the hallway, the wheels rumbling like distant thunder. Andrew didn't follow her to the elevator. He stayed in the bedroom, listening. He heard the front door open. He heard the pause, perhaps a second of regret, or maybe just adjusting her grip on the handle. Then, the heavy thud of the door closing. The electronic lock beeped once, engaging the deadbolt. He walked to the window and looked down at the street, 20 stories below. A minute later, he saw her emerge onto the sidewalk. A battered white van idled at the curb. A figure with messy hair hopped out. Julian. He didn't grab her bags. He embraced her, spinning her around in a cinematic twirl that looked ridiculous from this height. Then, Julia lifted her own heavy suitcases into the back of the van, while Julian held the door open for her. Andrew watched the taillights fade into the rainy Seattle night. He turned back to the empty room. The closet doors were gaping open, hangers swinging empty on the rod. The house was quiet. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel like tension. It felt like a balance sheet that had finally been zeroed out. He walked out of the bedroom, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. "This is card services," the automated voice chirped. "Report lost or stolen," Andrew said clearly to the empty room. The automated voice on the other end of the line was cheerful, a stark contrast to the hollow atmosphere of the penthouse. Andrew sat at the kitchen island, the marble cool against his forearms. A glass of single malt whiskey sat untouched beside his phone, the amber liquid catching the reflection of the under-cabinet lighting. For lost or stolen cards, press 1. To report fraud, press 2. To manage authorized users, Andrew pressed 3. His finger didn't shake. The numbness from the bedroom had calcified into something harder, something functional. He was an architect. He knew that when a load-bearing element was removed, you didn't just stand there and watch the roof collapse. You shored up the remaining walls. You secured the perimeter. "Please say the name of the authorized user you wish to remove," the system requested. "Julia Vance," Andrew said. His voice sounded foreign in the empty room, flat and devoid of the affection that used to color her name. "Confirming removal of Julia Vance from the Platinum Rewards account. Is this correct?" "Yes." "Processing. Please wait." The hold music was a tinny, synthesized jazz loop. Andrew looked around the open-plan living area. It was impeccable. The cleaning service had come yesterday. The throw pillows were karate-chopped in the center just the way the interior designer suggested. Julia hated that. She said it looked like a hotel lobby. She wanted mess. She wanted life. She wanted the chaotic authenticity of paint splatters and wine stains. Now, she had them. And he had this, the quiet, expensive order she had abandoned. "The user has been removed. The card ending in 4092 is now deactivated. Would you like to make another change?" "Yes," Andrew said. "The joint checking account. I need to transfer the primary balance to my personal savings and restrict access to the overdraft protection." This took longer. He had to speak to a human representative, a tired-sounding woman named Brenda, who asked too many security questions. Andrew answered them all with robotic precision. Mother's maiden name. First pet. High school mascot. The trivia of his identity used to dismantle the partnership of his life. As he worked through the list, freezing the secondary credit line, changing the password to the investment portal, unlinking her phone from the family cloud plan. He felt a strange sense of vertigo. 10 years of marriage, woven into thousands of digital threads, were being snipped one by one. It was terrifyingly easy. The legal divorce would take months, lawyers, and mediators. But the financial divorce? The end of the we that paid the bills? That took 45 minutes. When he finally hung up the phone, the silence of the apartment felt different. It was no longer the heavy silence of a pending argument. It was the absolute silence of a vacuum. Andrew stood up and walked to the wall-mounted smart home panel. The screen glowed with the status of the apartment. Temperature 72 degrees. Humidity 40%. Front door locked. He tapped the security settings. The code for the front door had been their anniversary date, 10/14. He stared at the numbers for a long moment. It felt petty to change it so soon, a childish act of shutting her out. But then he remembered the look on her face when she said his safety was a prison. He remembered the van idling downstairs, the vessel of her liberation. Prisons have locks to keep people in. Sanctuaries have locks to keep threats out. He tapped the screen. Change entry code. He typed in a new 4-digit sequence, random, meaningless numbers generated by the system. 8259. He memorized it, wiped the screen clean of fingerprints, and stepped back. He picked up the whiskey glass, finally taking a sip. It burned, a clean, sharp heat that grounded him. He walked to the window and looked out at the city, a sprawling grid of lights under the relentless rain. Somewhere out there, in a drafty studio that smelled of oil paint and delusion, Julia was probably toasting to her freedom. She was likely celebrating the end of his control, unaware that she had also just celebrated the end of her subsidy. Andrew turned off the living room lights. Darkness swallowed the furniture, the art, the empty spaces. He didn't feel liberated, and he didn't feel vindicated. He just felt tired. But the bills were paid, the assets were secured, and the structure was still standing. The morning light in Julian's studio did not filter through UV-protected double-paned glass. It slammed through the grimy, industrial windows of the converted warehouse, carrying with it the gray chill of a Seattle November. Julia woke up shivering. The heating system in the loft was a labyrinth of exposed pipes that clanked and groaned, but produced very little warmth. She pulled the thin, eclectic quilt tighter around her shoulders. It smelled of turpentine and stale tobacco, a scent she currently defined as the musk of creativity. Beside her, on the mattress pushed directly against the floorboards, Julian was already awake. He was standing before a massive canvas, shirtless, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he attacked the surface with a palette knife. He looked like a photograph from a vintage magazine, a perfect cliché of the tortured artist. "You look beautiful in the gray light," Julian said without turning around, sensing her movement. "Like a tragic ghost." Julia smiled, stretching her limbs. Her back ached. The mattress was a far cry from the ergonomic memory foam sanctuary she had shared with Andrew, but she told herself the ache was a sign of being alive. It was visceral. It was real. "Is there coffee?" she asked, swinging her legs out of bed. Her feet recoiled against the freezing concrete floor. "In the press. It's old, though, from yesterday," Julian murmured, stepping back to squint at a splash of crimson oil paint. "Fresh coffee is for the bourgeoisie. We run on caffeine and angst here." He laughed, a charming, boyish sound that made Julia giggle. She walked to the kitchenette. a corner of the room partitioned off by a stack of milk crates filled with vinyl records. The sink was full of dishes that had been soaking for 3 days. She found a mug with a chipped rim, rinsed it under the tap, and poured the cold, sludge-like coffee. She leaned against the counter, sipping the bitter liquid, and surveyed her new kingdom. The loft was a chaotic explosion of life. Clothes were draped over easels, books were stacked in precarious towers, empty wine bottles lined the windowsill like glass sentinels. It was messy, dusty, and loud. The sound of traffic from the viaduct outside was a constant roar. But to Julia, it felt like a liberation. Andrew's apartment had been a vacuum where dust dared not settle. Here, the dust danced in the light. Her gaze drifted to the metal front door. Beside it, on a small, wobbly stool, lay a growing pile of envelopes. Some were white and official-looking. Others were colorful flyers. They were beginning to slide off the stool onto the floor. "Julian," she called out over the hiss of a passing bus. "The mail is piling up. Should we go through it?" Julian waved a paint-stained hand dismissively, not looking away from his creation. "Entropy, my love. Just paper and noise. If it's important, they'll send a courier. If it's a bill, it's a construct of the capitalist machine designed to kill the vibe. Don't let the mundane infect the divine." Julia felt a flicker of unease, the reflexive panic of a woman who had spent a decade managing a household with military precision. But she looked at Julian, at the way the muscles in his back moved as he painted, at the sheer passion he poured into something as useless and beautiful as art. She crushed the instinct to organize. She suppressed the urge to find a letter opener. This was why she had left. She had left to escape the tyranny of the mundane. Andrew would have already categorized those envelopes, scheduled the payments, and filed the receipts. Andrew was a machine. Julian was a soul. "You're right," Julia said, setting the mug down on a stack of magazines. She walked over to him, avoiding a splatter of blue paint on the floor, and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. His skin was cold, but his energy was hot. "Let them pile up," she whispered into his shoulder. "We have better things to do." Julian turned in her arms, smearing a trace of red paint onto the sleeve of her silk robe, the one thing she hadn't packed away yet. He kissed her, and for a moment, the cold draft and the bitter coffee didn't matter. She was the muse in the warehouse. The reality of the world outside the heavy metal door felt a million miles away. She didn't notice that one of the envelopes on the floor had slipped entirely off the stool. It was a windowed envelope, pink, the universal color of a final notice. The rain had turned the streets of the industrial district into a slick, oil-streaked mirror. Julia stepped out of the heavy metal door of the warehouse, balancing a portfolio case and her purse, trying to open a large umbrella against the wind. She had a meeting with a potential buyer for one of Julian's larger pieces, a meeting she had arranged, using her old connections to try and generate some cash flow. She looked toward the curb where she always parked her Range Rover. It was the one clean, gleaming object on a block lined with dumpsters and rusted sedans. The spot was empty. Julia blinked, lowering the umbrella slightly as if the rain were obscuring her vision. She looked up the street, then down. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. The car wasn't just a vehicle. It was her armor. It was the last bubble of climate-controlled, heated seat safety she had left. "No, no, no," she muttered, fumbling for her phone. Her fingers slipped on the wet screen as she dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency?" "My car," Julia gasped, her voice rising an octave. "It's been stolen. I'm on 4th and Industrial, a white Range Rover. I just came downstairs and— "One moment, ma'am." The dispatcher cut in, her voice bored. There was a pause, the sound of typing on the other end. "License plate ending in 7X2? Yes, have you found it?" "It hasn't been stolen, ma'am. It's in the repo database. It was picked up by Tow City Recovery about an hour ago." Julia stood frozen on the sidewalk, the rain soaking the hem of her trousers. "Repo? That's impossible. It's my car." "The lender issued the order for non-payment. You'll have to take it up with them." The line went dead. Non-payment. The words echoed in her head. She stood there for a full minute, the water dripping from the umbrella onto her hand. The lease. It was auto-debited. Andrew had set it up 3 years ago. She had never written a check for it, never saw the statement. In her mind, the car simply existed, like gravity. She had forgotten that gravity, in her previous life, cost $800 a month. She turned around and ran back inside, the portfolio banging against her hip. She took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the studio breathless and dripping wet. Julian was where she had left him, lying on the floor with headphones on, staring at the ceiling. He didn't look up when the door slammed. "Julian!" she shouted, the panic making her voice shrill. "They took the car. They repossessed the Rover." He pulled one headphone off, looking at her with mild confusion. "Who?" "The bank. The repo men." Andrew stopped paying the lease. She paced the room, her heels clicking frantically on the concrete. "I need to get it back. I have a client meeting in an hour. I can't show up in an Uber, Julian. I need $4,000 to clear the arrears and penalties. I checked the account on the way up. I only have 300. She looked at him, waiting. This was the moment. The moment the partner steps up. The moment the true love says, "We will fix this." Julian sat up slowly, scratching his beard. He looked at her not with sympathy, but with a vague sense of disappointment. "Babe," he said, his voice slow, dripping with condescension. "Listen to yourself. You sound like them." "Like who?" "Like the suits, the zombies." He stood up and walked over to her, trying to put a hand on her shoulder. She shrugged it off. "It's a car, Julia. A massive gas-guzzling tank that screams suburban repression. You don't need it. We live in the city. We have feet. We have the van." "The van doesn't have a passenger seatbelt, Julian. And I can't drive the van to meet a collector from the Tate." Her voice cracked. "I need money. Do you have anything? From the last sale?" Julian laughed, a short, dry bark. "Money is fluid, Julia. It comes, it goes. I bought supplies. I paid some back rent on the space. You know I don't hoard cash like a squirrel. That's scarcity mindset." "It's not scarcity mindset. It's solvency." She stared at him, really seeing the apathy in his eyes. He wasn't worried. He wasn't worried because the consequences never touched him. He was comfortable in the squalor because he didn't know any better. "You're overreacting," Julian sighed, putting his headphones back on. "Take a breath. Let the attachment go. You'll feel lighter." He lay back down. Julia stood in the center of the drafty room, her wet clothes clinging to her skin. The portfolio felt heavy in her hand. For the first time, the Bohemian dream didn't look romantic. It looked like a trap. She looked at the pile of unopened mail by the door, the pile she had agreed to ignore. She walked over to it and picked up the pink envelope that had fallen to the floor days ago. She tore it open. Final notice. Electricity service disconnection scheduled for Nov 14th. Today was the 14th. The silence that fell over the warehouse was absolute. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a library. It was the sudden, mechanical death of the building's hum. The refrigerator compressor shuddered and stopped. The faint buzz of the overhead halogen lamps vanished. And most critically, the electric space heaters, the only barrier between them and the 40-degree air outside, clicked off. Julia stood in the center of the room, a half-peeled orange in her hand. The darkness was sudden and total, save for the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights filtering through the grime of the windows. "Julian?" she called out. Her breath misted in the air, a white ghost escaping her lips. "Circuit breaker probably tripped." Julian's voice came from the bedroom area, unconcerned. "Old wiring, it happens. Adds character." "It's not the breaker, Julian," Julia said, her voice tight. She walked to the window, looking down at the street. The building across the alley was blazing with light. The street lamps were on. It was just them. "The power is out." They cut it. "The notice. The one I showed you 2 weeks ago." There was a rustling sound, then the flare of a match. Julian appeared in the doorway, holding a half-burned candle. The flame cast long, dancing shadows on his face, making his unkempt beard look wilder, less intentionally groomed. "Well," he said, moving to light another candle on a stack of books. "We have wax. We have wine. Let's not let the utility company dictate our mood, Jules. It's actually quite beautiful, like living in a Caravaggio painting." Julia felt a snap inside her chest, sharper than the cold. She didn't want to live in a Caravaggio. She wanted central heating. She wanted to not see her own breath in her living room. She grabbed her phone to check her balance, praying for a miracle, but the screen dimmed to save battery. 42:18. That was all that remained of the bridge she had taken from Andrew. "This isn't a painting, Julian. It's freezing. It's going to drop to 30 degrees tonight." She wrapped her arms around herself, the silk of her robe offering zero protection against the encroaching chill. "We need to pay the bill. How much do you have left from the portrait commission?" Julian sighed, the sound of a man bored by a repetitive song. He sat on the edge of the sofa, pouring red wine into a dirty glass. "I had to buy the cobalt blue pigment and the vintage frames from that estate sale in Fremont. They were a steal, Julia. I couldn't leave them." "You bought frames," Julia whispered, the absurdity choking her. "We have no heat. We have no hot water. And you bought frames for paintings you haven't even painted yet? Art requires sacrifice," Julian snapped, slamming the glass down. "You sound just like him, always obsessing over the logistics. You wanted a real life, didn't you? This is real. Sometimes you're cold. Sometimes you're hungry. It makes the art better." "It makes you irresponsible," Julia shouted. The sound bounced off the concrete walls, harsh and ugly. "I gave up everything for this. I gave up a home. I gave up a life where I didn't have to wear a parka to bed." "Then go back." Julian gestured wildly with the wine glass, spilling dark drops onto the floor. "If you miss the golden cage so much, go back to the accountant. I'm sure he has the thermostat set to a perfect 72 degrees. The mention of Andrew stopped her. She looked at Julian, shivering in his flannel shirt, arrogant in his poverty, dismissing her physical pain as a lack of artistic vision. Then she thought of Andrew. Andrew, who used to wake up before her in the winter to turn on the heated floors in the bathroom so her feet wouldn't get cold. Andrew, who didn't write poetry, but made sure the generator was serviced every October. She had called that boring. She had called it suffocating. Now, as the cold seeped through the soles of her feet and settled into her bones, she realized that warmth wasn't a given. It was a purchase, and she could no longer afford it. She didn't scream back. She simply walked over to the pile of clothes on the chair, pulled on her heavy wool coat, and sat down on the far side of the room. "Where are you going?" Julian asked, his tone softening slightly, sensing he had pushed too far. "Nowhere," Julia said, pulling her knees to her chest. "I have nowhere to go." She stared out the window at the distant skyline of downtown Seattle. Somewhere in one of those glittering towers was a penthouse that was warm, bright, and paid for. The distance between her and that light felt infinite. The dawn brought light, but it did not bring heat. The warehouse studio was a gray, refrigerated box. Julian was still asleep on the mattress, buried under a mound of blankets and coats, snoring softly. He looked peaceful, unburdened by the fact that they had no electricity and less than $50 to their names. Julia sat on the edge of the windowsill, her knees pulled to her chest. She was wearing 3 layers of sweaters, yet the cold seemed to radiate from her bones outward. Her phone lay in her lap, the battery bar red and critical, much like her life. She had charged it for 20 minutes at a coffee shop down the street before the barista had politely asked her to buy something or leave. She stared at the contact name, Andrew. For 10 years, that name had meant safety. It meant problems were solved before she even knew they existed. It meant the car started, the house was warm, and the bills were auto-paid. She had called that boredom. Now, shivering in a room that smelled of stale wine and turpentine, she realized she had misspelled stability. She picked up the phone. Her thumb hovered over the call button. The humiliation was a physical taste in her mouth, bitter and metallic. But then she looked at Julian, at the dirty dishes, the unpaid notices, the carefree selfishness of his slumber, and the humiliation was replaced by a sharper pang. Hunger. She pressed call. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. She held her breath, preparing a voicemail, a casual script about legal papers. "Hello?" Andrew's voice was clear, crisp, and devoid of background noise. He was likely in his office, or perhaps in the quiet cabin of his car. The sound of his voice, so steady and composed, nearly made her sob. "Andrew," Julia said, forcing a brightness into her tone that she didn't feel. "It's me, Julia." "I know," he said. There was no warmth, just acknowledgement. "What do you need, Julia? I'm heading into a site meeting." I was just going through some boxes," she lied, her eyes fixed on a spider web trembling in the draft near the ceiling. "And I found that menu. From Le Pichet. Remember? The place we went for our 5th anniversary. The one where we ordered the roast chicken and waited an hour for it?" Silence. The line crackled with dead air. She was fishing, casting a line into the deep waters of their shared history, hoping to snag a remnant of affection. "I remember the chicken, Julia," Andrew said finally. His tone remained flat. "Why are you calling me about a menu?" I was thinking about us, about how things ended so abruptly." She dropped her voice to a whisper, glancing at the sleeping Julian. "I think we rushed the paperwork. I think maybe we didn't really talk, not really." "We talked plenty," Andrew countered. "You spoke about prison. You spoke about true love. I listened." "I was emotional," she said quickly, desperation leaking into her voice. "I was confused. Andrew, can we meet? Just for coffee, to discuss the final settlement details, face to face. I think we owe each other that." She waited. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't asking for a settlement discussion. She was asking for a rescue. She wanted him to see her, to see how thin she had become, to see the regret in her eyes, and to offer to pay the check one last time. "I have a gap in my schedule at 4, Andrew said. "The Starbucks in the lobby of my building. 30 minutes. "The lobby." She hesitated. It was so public, so impersonal. "Can't we go somewhere quieter? Maybe dinner?" 4 o'clock, Julia. Or we can handle the rest through the lawyers. The ultimatum hung there. He wasn't bending. The flexible, accommodating husband who would drive across town to bring her takeout was gone. In his place was the architect, managing a difficult contractor. 4 is fine, she whispered. "I'll be there." "Don't be late," he said, and the line went dead. Julia lowered the phone. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. Her hair was frizzy from the damp air, her skin pale. She needed to shower. She needed to look like the woman he remembered, not the wreckage she had become. But the water in the bathroom was ice cold. She stood up, stepping over a pile of Julian's discarded sketches. She would boil water on the camping stove. She would put on her last clean dress. She was going to an interview for the position of wife, and she knew with terrifying clarity that she was no longer the only candidate for the job. The automatic revolving doors of the high-rise spun with a heavy, pressurized whoosh, sealing the cold November wind outside. Julia stepped into the lobby, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. It smelled of roasted coffee beans, floor wax, and expensive cologne, the scent of the world she used to inhabit. She spotted Andrew immediately. He was sitting at a small round table near the window, reviewing a document on his tablet. He wore a charcoal wool coat over a crisp white shirt, clean-shaven, looking rested. He looked like a man who slept on high thread count sheets and didn't worry about the price of heating oil. Julia smoothed the front of her coat. It was the best thing she had left, but she knew the hem was mud-stained from the walk to the bus stop. She took a breath, composed her face into a mask of tragic vulnerability, and approached the table. "Andrew," she said softly. He looked up. His eyes were clear. There was no anger in them, but there was no spark either. It was the way one looks at a stranger who has accidentally bumped into them on the subway. Polite but unengaged. "Julia," he nodded, gesturing to the empty chair. "Have a seat. I ordered you a latte. Non-fat, no foam. That's still your order, right?" "Yes," she said, sinking into the chair. She wrapped her hands around the paper cup, desperate for the warmth. "Thank you. You always remembered the little things." "It's not memory, it's a habit," Andrew said, putting his tablet away. "I have 20 minutes, Julia. You said on the phone you wanted to discuss the settlement details." Julia took a sip. The hot liquid scalded her tongue, but she welcomed the pain. It woke her up. "I wanted to see you. The lawyers. They make everything so ugly. I wanted to remember who we were before all the paperwork." She reached across the table, her fingers grazing the sleeve of his coat. "Julian and I. It's been difficult. The artistic process is chaotic. I think I underestimated how much I needed balance, how much I needed a partner who understands the real world." Andrew looked at her hand on his sleeve. He didn't pull away violently. He simply shifted his position to pick up his coffee, causing her hand to fall back onto the cold marble table. "You didn't want balance, Julia. You wanted intensity. You said balance was a prison." "I was wrong," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. They were genuine tears, born of exhaustion and the terrifying realization that she had burned the only bridge that could lead her home. "I miss the apartment. I miss us. I think..." I think if we tried... Andrew reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it gently on the table between them, effectively building a wall. "These are the final papers," Andrew said. His voice was steady, void of malice. "I signed them this morning. I've agreed to the lump sum alimony your lawyer requested. It's enough to get you a small apartment, maybe a used car. It's a clean break." Julia stared at the envelope. It wasn't a lifeline. It was a severance package. "Andrew, please." "I'm drowning." "Then you should ask the man who truly loves you to teach you how to swim," Andrew said. He stood up, buttoning his coat. "You wanted a life based on passion, not bills. You have it now. I'm not the villain keeping you apart anymore, and I'm not the safety net underneath you." "You're just going to leave me here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to work," Andrew corrected. "I have a life to build, and you have an artist to inspire." He looked down at her one last time. For a second, she thought she saw pity, but it wasn't pity. It was relief. "Goodbye, Julia." He turned and walked toward the elevators, his stride long and confident. He didn't look back. He merged into the crowd of professionals, just another successful man going about his Tuesday. Julia sat alone at the small table. The lobby bustled around her, phones ringing, deals being made, the hum of commerce and stability. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the half-finished latte that was rapidly cooling. Outside the glass walls, the rain began to fall harder, blurring the city into a gray smear. She would have to finish the coffee, then she would have to walk back to the bus stop, and then she would have to go back to the warehouse, where the love was true. The room was freezing, and the bills were waiting on the floor.